Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here once again with Gaven Kerr. Gaven has been a great, participant on the show. He's been someone very enjoyable to talk to, and I'm really thankful to have him on again. So we're going to talk about creation and resurrection this time. So we're branching out more from just the Deante, although it does have a connection to the Deante, into kind of wider theological considerations. So Gavin, let me just start off by asking you, before I go to the question on the docket, I wanted to ask you, so this book, Aquinas and the Metaphysics of Creation, this came this came after your book on the Deante.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write on creation after you just talked about the Deante?
Yeah, so it's interesting with those two books. They were both born out of articles that I published. The Deante book was born out of an article that I wrote on the Deante proof. And, you know, one of the reviewers of the article, it was published in the Journal of Philosophical Research. And one of the reviewers for the article says, this is quite an in-depth article. There's a lot to this. I think, a larger publication could be made out of this. And that was towards the end of my doctorate that I was writing that article. So I thought, now that my doctorate's over, I may as well just get the head down and, start writing a book on the issue. And so the stuff on Essentially Ordered Series, which appeared in another article, kind of cemented some of my ideas for the book. And so I ended up publishing the Deante book. But also, just after I published the first Deante article, I also published an article in Religious Studies on a Thomistic Metaphysics of Creation, where I was engaged with Stephen Hawking, because Stephen Hawking, in A Brief History of Time, pointed out that the universe can be finite, but without a beginning. And he reasoned that, well, look, if it doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have a cause. So his reasoning was that whatever has a beginning has a cause. The universe doesn't have a beginning, therefore the universe doesn't have a cause, which is a clear fallacy of denying the antecedent. So the fallacy of denying the antecedent is, take a different example. If I'm a teacher, I have a job. I'm not a teacher, therefore I don't have a job, which is obviously fallacious. So reading Hawking in A Brief History of Time sort of made me realize that. And I thought, well, you know what? Hawking is stepping into this issue of the beginninglessness or otherwise of creation, and whether or not an eternally created universe is possible. And it seemed to me, Aquinas did defend the possibility of an eternally created universe. So it seemed to me, well, look, this is something maybe that we should write about, and we should figure out what the metaphysics is here, how it can be that the universe still needs a creator, regardless of whether or not the universe had a beginning. And so Hawking was a nice springboard to consider that, and that paper got published in Religious Studies. So after I published the book on Deante, after it went through, one of the reviewers suggested to me that insofar as the final chapter of the Deante book was just a cursory look at the metaphysics of creation based on essence and essay, he suggested, really, a full-length study of this in Aquinas would be welcome. A monograph based on this sort of existentialist metaphysics at work in the Deante proof would be welcome, just looking at different aspects of creation. So I thought, well, I may as well do that. I published an article on something similar, so I may as well work that up into a book. And so I did that and submitted it. When did I submit it? Just early 2018. I submitted it in January 2018, actually. And then by Easter 2018, I got word back from Oxford that it was passed for publication. So I worked it up then, got the manuscript in that winter. So round about autumn, winter 2018. And then it came out the following year, September 2019. So that's why I wrote the book. That's the history of how the book came to be written. So here we are today.
Yeah, it's a great story. So, now diving into the book itself, I'm interested in the understanding creation as the noun, and then the act of creation as the verb, right? So, how does Aquinas look at creation itself, and how does he view God's act of creation?
Yeah. Okay, so creation itself, or the creature, is anything in which essence and existence are distinct. So anything which is dependent for its existence is a creature. So the things that exist, creatures, are substances. So things like you and me, rocks, elements, trees, that sort of thing, angels, all of those are creatures insofar as they're subject to composition of essence and existence. They have different components, but those components aren't creatures, even though they've been created. Or it's not even right to say they've been created, even though those different components we have, they're parts of creation, but they're not creatures. They're not subject to an act of creation. They're co-created in the thing. So let's say I'm composed of matter and form. My matter isn't a creature. My form isn't a creature. I am the creature, and I have matter and form. So matter and form are co-created with the creation of me. And that leads us into that issue of what is it for God to engage in an act of creation? And in a number of sort of formulaic statements, Thomas says that to create is to produce the total substance in being, or in esse. In other words, it's to grant esse to the substance whole and complete. Now, that doesn't mean that, the substance, like, I'm a whole and complete substance, but that doesn't mean that, God in a single act just produces me 37 years old as I am here and now. Rather, that it's the whole substance, its matter and its form, comes to participate in its active existence, in its esse. And that's what that's what it is for God to create something, is to grant esse to it. So how does that sound for starters?
Yeah, it's a good start to understand, that distinction, right? Because I think a lot of people, for us especially, because we emphasize composition, it's not just like God kind of sets the ball rolling and then things kind of exist on their own. We'll get to that, right? But composition is so key to understanding, that we have a God who is not composed of anything, but everything else that participates in him is composed, right? Of its metaphysical parts. So then when we get to the next question, about, let's see here, what do I have here? It says, based on the 5 ways, including the deante argument for God, what do we learn about God's relationship to creation? So I'm interested, like, each of the 5 ways kind of show us, get us to, they get us to a God who's pure act, a God who's the first cause, the first mover. What when we say these things of God, what do we learn about his relationship to creatures and creation?
Yeah, great, perfect. So I would say, yeah, you're right. The 5 ways, when properly understood, get you to a God who is pure actuality. I would go further, and I would say that they get us to a God who is pure existence itself. That each of the created effects utilized in the 5 ways to get us to God are actually disclosive of dependency, or revelatory of dependency, for esse, or for existence, each one of them. So it reveals that the thing in question is dependent for its esse or its existence in some way, which is why at the end of each of the 5 ways, Thomas can say, this is what we understand God to be, or this is what we call God. And how do we know that? Well, look at the sed contra. The sed contra describes God as he who is. So each of the 5 ways, and saying this is what we understand God to be, we understand him as he who is. And so Thomas intends with each of them to arrive at God as pure existence itself, just like the deante, and in several other places where he arrives at the same sort of conclusion. So that being the case, what God creates then, creatures, are things which are dependent for their esse, for their existence, and then that means that creatures are an effect of God. Okay, so they're dependent on God. They participate in the existence that he grants to them for their being. So what does that say about the relationship of God to creatures, or better, the relationship of creatures to God? Thomas distinguishes 2 kinds of relation, which allows him to set up 3 types of relationship. So there are 2 kinds of relations. They're what are called logical relations, and they're what are called real relations. Real relations depend on some feature of the thing itself, some feature that the thing has, irrespective of how we think about it. Okay, it's not dependent on how we think about it or how we conceive it. In other words, it's not dependent on, our logical operations or our conceptual capacities and the concepts that we use to think about the thing. So a classic example of a real relation is taller than. A is taller than B because there is something about A, i.e. its quantity measured in terms of its height, by which it exceeds that of B. B is shorter than A, again because of some real feature of B, which makes B less in quantity in terms of its height than A. So you can have the taller than and shorter than relationship because there is something in the things so related by which they are related. Should the things change, the relations will change. Okay, so should B grow taller than A, there is a real change in B by which B now is considered to be taller than A and A is shorter than B. Okay, so that's real relations. Logical relations then are not like that. Logical relations don't depend on real features of the thing. Rather, they depend on how we think about the thing. And the classic example here is self-identity. A thing is identical to itself, not because there are actually two things and we look at them like twins and say, you know, well, that's identical to that, but rather we represent, as it were, the same thing to ourselves twice over. And we judge that it is identical with itself because it's one and the same thing. And that's a logical relation. So it's dependent on how we think about things. Now, on the basis of that, Thomas holds that there are three different kinds of relationship. There's a relationship in which the things related are related wholly, are related only by means of real relations, so taller than and shorter than. So the two members of the relationship are related by real relations. There is another kind of relationship where it's wholly logical relations involved. And then there's what's called the third type is the mixed relationship. And a mixed relationship is such that one of the things that related bears a real relationship, whereas the other thing related only bears a logical relationship. And the example that Thomas gives here is a case of knowing. So let's say there's a tree in front of me, okay, and I know this tree, or I know something about this tree. The tree is the cause of my knowledge. My knowledge is an effect of the tree, assuming realism. Okay, I'm really related to the tree because there is something in me by which I am related to the tree. My knowledge is dependent on that of the tree. If the tree weren't there, I would be lacking in something. I would be lacking in that relationship. On the other hand, the tree isn't really related to me in my knowing it. The tree would remain as it is. It wouldn't change were I not to know it. So my knowing of the tree doesn't affect the tree, doesn't do anything to the tree in any way, doesn't produce anything, any change in the tree. So the tree only bears a logical relationship to me, a logical relation to me, whereas I have a real relation to the tree. The tree does produce something in me, the knowledge of it, by means of which I'm related to it. Now, it's that kind of relationship then that obtains between God and creatures. God produces something in the creature by which it is a creature, i.e., God grants esse, or the act of existence, to the creature. So the creature is really related to God. Were God not to act to produce, existence in the creature just wouldn't be. So it'd be significantly different. It'd be fundamentally different because it wouldn't exist. In the same way that if the tree just wasn't there, I wouldn't have the knowledge of the tree. And that's how I'm really related to the tree. So similarly, creatures are really related to God in that way. But on the other hand, God doesn't bear a real relationship or a real relation to creatures. This is because, like the tree, there's nothing which changes in God when creatures come into existence. Okay, so God remains as he is. He doesn't change. Were there to be no creatures, God would be exactly the same. There would be no difference in God. So God only has a logical relation to creatures. He doesn't bear a real relationship to them. He doesn't lose anything. It doesn't cost him anything to grant existence to creatures, but creatures gain something in being brought into a relation with him. So it's a mixed relation between God and creatures, and that's borne out then by Thomas's view that in creation, God as pure existence itself is granting existence to things. So there's a bit of a start on that one. So will we chase that up a bit further?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure someone might have the objection or question. Well, consider like God before creation, right? He is not the creator. He is just God, right? And then after the creation, God goes from being just God to being the creator, right? So doesn't it seem as if there's a real change in God at that point?
Okay. Yeah. So God isn't, essentially identified as creator or, not a creator or anything like that. Rather, it's creatures who change with creation, and then creatures think of God as, primary cause, as creator, or anything like that. Okay, but God just is pure existence itself, and always will be pure existence itself. He doesn't take on a new relation whenever he grants existence to things, because there is nothing in him by which he is tied to creatures. There's nothing produced in him by which there is a connection with creatures. Rather, what is produced is the act of existence in the creature, and that ties the creature to the creator. So there isn't any change which God undergoes in creating things.
Right, because God is pure existence itself. When he grants existence to something else, he still is pure existence. That's still totally, let's say, in keeping with who he is, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, like, so I guess the question would be, but like, must we say that God is essentially, or is necessarily the creator, right? So God must create.
Okay, so that's another interesting issue. So is God necessarily a creator? Must God create? The answer there is no. And this sort of takes in just a few issues with regard to God's divine nature, how we can characterize his nature. So sticking with that for a wee moment, if God is just pure existence itself, God is pure actuality. Okay, so he's not subject to any potency or potentiality. And insofar as God is not subject to any potentiality, God can't be composite in any way. There's no composition in God, because for something to be composite, it has to have some sort of potency which is actualized, and that's to allow for composition to occur, because composition is composition of act and potency. But insofar as he's pure existence itself, pure actuality, God doesn't have any potency, so no composition in him. Now, not only does that mean that God is free from all sorts of different compositions, such as essence, existence, matter, form, substance, and accident, it also means that there's no distinction and composition in God between the individual that God is and the nature that he has. So when you think of multiple things like human beings, there are lots of different individuals, and they're all distinct from the human nature that they have. So I am not human nature. I just have human nature. Same for yourself. Same for Socrates. And that's because we're composite entities. Okay, we stand in potency to the nature, making us the kind of thing that it is, and the nature is an actualizing principle, making us the human beings that we are. On the other hand, God, because he's not composite and not subject to any potency, he's pure existence itself. He is not an individual which instantiates a nature. Okay, he's not an instance of a nature. So it's not the case that, there being only one God is that he is the only instance of divinity, in the way that the last man on earth would be the only instance of humanity, but you could still have more such instances. Rather, whatever is in God is God. So God is his divinity. He doesn't have divinity. He simply is his divinity. So there's no distinction between what we say is supposite or individual and essence or nature in God. He's completely identical with himself, given lack of composition. All in all, then, God is utterly simple. Now, if there's no distinction between individual and nature or essence in God, there is no nature to which God is subject, which would force him to create, which would necessitate him to create. So there's nothing independent of God forcing his hand to create. To affirm that would be to say that you have a distinct nature to which God stands in potency, and which, actualizes him and sort of gets him to create, forces him to create. So Avicenna had this sort of view, given the necessity and eternity of God, for as long as you have God, you have creatures, so creation is eternal. Well, the Latin Avicenna, anyway. And it's actually against that view that Thomas argues in this way, that such a view presupposes that there is a distinct nature of necessity, a nature which necessitates God's choices in this regard, or, leaves God without a choice in this regard, as it were. But on the other hand, given that God doesn't have a nature distinct from himself, which necessitates him, he's free to create. So in creating, God is doing what he wants to do, not doing what he has to do. Okay, so it's a decision of God to create, as opposed to not to create. So he's not necessitated to create, to answer your
Hmm.
question there.
Yeah, so it's not as if like something external to God is pulling him to create, forcing his
Hmm.
hand, as you said, and
Yeah,
neither is it something in his own nature that is forcing him to create because he's identical
hmm,
to his nature.
exactly.
He's doing what God does.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
He's doing what he wants, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So then,
Mhm,
another question that I think one could ask is, well, I remember too, there was a question a while back, I think, on one of the pages that we follow
mhm,
or
mhm,
groups, and it said something like, "Could God have done otherwise?" Right?
mhm,
Or is it necessary for God to have done otherwise in order to be free?
mhm,
Right. And I remember some, our good friend Christopher, I think he answered yes to that. And then
mhm,
you answered no. And I agreed with you, no. But I wonder, like, so for some people, when they think about, oh, is God free? They start thinking about possible worlds where God creates in this
mhm,
possible world, but doesn't create in this possible world. And then
mhm,
once you start going down that route of thinking about alternate possibilities as alternate possible worlds, then you
mhm,
get into some dicey territory. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, do we have to posit possible worlds in order to preserve God's freedom, or what should we
mhm.
even engage in this talk of possible worlds?
I certainly don't think we should engage in this talk of possible worlds because, um, well, at least on the Thomist account, the only world that we need to make sense of is the actual world. And so when we think about what could have been the case, we look at what actually is the case and see how things could be different in that respect. So that doesn't, envisage possible worlds in which, we have, a particular thing with, say a set of properties that it'll have in all those worlds for it to be that thing, and then a set of properties that it won't have in all the worlds and just some of them, and thus distinguishing between its, necessary and, accidental properties. Um, we don't need to do that on the Thomist account because we can just look at what the actual thing is just to see what its essential properties are, not necessarily its necessary properties, but what its essential properties are, as opposed to its accidental properties. So just straight off the bat for Thomists, at least Thomists of my variety, possible worlds aren't useful. They're not doing anything metaphysically interesting. And that stands to reason because possible worlds metaphysics emerges out of a concern in quantified modal logic. How do we quantify in the modal discourse? So we've got the classic problems that Quine raises in reference and modality, where we have the distinction between de re and de dicto necessity. And so, necessity de dicto seems okay. We can talk about 9 being necessarily greater than 7, but de re necessity is a problem because, we can't really, talk about, the number of planets being 9 and thus the number of planets being necessarily greater than 7. That seems to be a problem. So whilst we might want to preserve de re or de dicto necessity, there might be a bit of a problem of de re necessity. And so the issue there is trying to attribute modal properties de re of things. And so, Kripke and Plantinga, they come up, with this possible world semantics by which we can do that. So that whole area of modal metaphysics is a reaction to issues in semantics, philosophy of language brought up by Quine, which the Thomists can, just stand back and read and think, yeah, okay, well, that's fine. But we have a whole different, semantical outlook. And we have a whole different metaphysical outlook, which doesn't lead us into any of those problems. So we don't even need to go down that rabbit hole of possible worlds. So that's just generally the approach I would take to possible worlds in metaphysics anyway. But with regard to God's freedom to create or not to create, the point here is that what would God have looked like? Would God look any different had he not created than if he had created? And the answer is no, because he would look exactly the same because he doesn't have a real relationship to creatures. If God changes in being a creator, i.e., if God changes because creatures come to be, then certainly, and this is what we were talking about earlier, then certainly God would go from being a non-creator to a creator. But in creating, God just is pure essay. He doesn't enter into any real relationship with creatures because there's nothing that he gains from creating anything. Rather, it's creatures which gain something. They gain the act of existence. So insofar as it's creatures which are changed in the act of creation, as opposed to God who is changed, then God would look exactly the same whether he chose to create or not create. So there's no difference in him. So regardless of the choice that he makes, he remains the same, whereas creatures would look different. And I think that's what's at stake in addressing, the issue of God's freedom to create or not create. So how does that sit for a start?
Yeah, I mean, like, just to maybe use an analogy. I know analogies can be a little dangerous, but thinking about God as the fullness of reality, right? So literally the fullness of reality, and then God then creates other beings who are necessarily, let's say, anything that's not God is, and it's created, and it was a creature, is going to be composed, right? So it has composition. So it's like the fullness of reality creates other, let's say, realities, which are these composite creatures. But if God's the fullness of reality, then nothing actually, then it's like, I don't know how to put it, but like, I don't know. It's like, God is like this wealth of of existence. And this wealth of existence is so rich that even when it spreads and manifests itself, and forms things or invests in things, right? It's not like anything less comes out of the fullness of existence, or anything is leaving the account, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
And he doesn't gain anything either.
Yeah.
There's existing. He still remains pure existence, pure goodness. All of those divine attributes are all still there, even with creatures. So with creatures or without creatures, he's exactly the same. He's still just the fullness of existence. Creatures are lesser manifestations of God's being, but they don't actualize God's being or add to it in any way.
That's right.
So he remains unchanged throughout the whole process, whereas it's creatures who are changed.
Yeah, like the best analogy I can think of is like, imagine like infinity, right? So I don't know, like the set of all numbers, right? Rational, whatever, include them all. And then you say, I have the number one. So the number one has detracted from the infinite set. It's like, wait, no, that's not how that works. I don't know. That's an analogy that I have or see, right?
Yeah. I mean, I typically think about it, with regard to illumination of things by the sun. I mean, things come to be illuminated by the sun. Now, regardless of how many or how little things are on the earth, and how many things come and go on the earth, they're all still just being illuminated by the same light of the sun.
Yeah, that's right.
So, regardless, of how many things you have, how many or how less things you have, the light of the sun is still emanating and covering the things on the earth. That's the analogy that I tend to go for when thinking about this. And so it's not that, the changes of the number of things on the earth affect, the sun giving out its rays. It's the internal nature of the sun which will affect its illuminating, not what is illuminated. And it's similar here for God. It's the nature of God which affects, basically just, his being pure essay. He is pure essay because of his intrinsic nature. It's not creatures which affect his intrinsic nature in any way, because they just come to enjoy the illumination of existence which he grants. But in coming to enjoy that, they don't affect his intrinsic nature.
Yeah, I've been falling more and more in love with St. Thomas's Neoplatonic thought. Yeah, very beautiful. So I want to ask you now, Gavin. I mean, is it possible that the universe always existed? And if so, does this pose a problem for classical theism?
It's certainly possible. I think that the universe always existed. And I remember reading St. Thomas on this. And his point is really that to hold that there is no beginning to the universe is just to hold that there has always been things in the past. There's just always been changeable things in the past. That's back into the past, there's been an infinite number of such changeable things, because time is the measurement of motion of the before and after in a process of change. So as long as you have changing things, you have time. So if you have an infinite number of changing things, you have infinite time. So universe without a beginning, no beginning to creation. Now, what does that mean? It just means you have an infinite number of changing things. But as we know from the distinction of per se and per accidens causal series, none of those changing temporal things have it in themselves to exist. Okay, so they're subject to distinction and composition of essence and existence. So the need for a primary cause is not the need for there being something first, okay, to kind of, just get the ball rolling. Rather, it's more like the hook on which such things need to hang. Because insofar as none of those infinite number of changing things have existence identical to their essences, they depend on something which does have existence in and of itself and can originate existence. That's the sort of stuff, I think we've talked about it in the past on per se and per accident causal series, that such changing things are members of a per se ordered series precisely because they don't have the causality of the series in virtue of what they are, but they're lacking such causality, so that unless they participate in the causality of a primary cause, they just wouldn't have that causality, which in this case is existence. So unless there's a primary cause whose essence is its existence, that infinite number of changing things just wouldn't be able to enjoy existence, even though there was no beginning. And a good analogy, which illustrates this, comes from Richard Taylor, who I think was at a conference that I was at just over the weekend there, because there was a Richard Taylor raising issues, for some of the speakers, from a kind of Neoplatonic point of view, concerning some of these matters. So I think it was the same Richard Taylor. But in any case, I got this analogy from Richard Taylor. And this sort of illustrates Thomas's point that you can have an eternally created universe. So imagine you have the sun and the moon, and they never began to exist. Okay, so they never had a beginning, so they've been existing for eternity, or at least time without end. So there's no beginning to the sun and the moon; they've just always existed. Now the sun is illuminating the moon, so the illumination of the moon by the sun never had a beginning. So for beginninglessly into the past, the moon is being illuminated by the sun. So the illumination of the moon is being caused by the sun without beginning. So there was no beginning to the illumination of the moon by the sun, yet we can legitimately speak of the sun's illuminating the moon, because if you remove the sun, the moon would cease to be illuminated. It's not self-illuminating. Well, in the same way that an infinite number of changing creatures are not self-existing, okay, such creatures just don't exist in virtue of what they are. So they depend on something, the primary cause, the arguments of which we've gone through before. They depend on a primary cause, which does exist in virtue of what it is, i.e. its essence is its existence. So you can have an eternally created universe. In other words, a universe without a beginning, which still requires a cause. And in fact, that was, the first article I wrote on this against Hawking, that, even if you have a universe without a beginning, you still need a cause for the universe, or depending on how you characterize the universe, the things which exist and go to make up the universe, they all still need a cause. And so we still need a primary cause. And that was Thomas's view. Now, is that a challenge to classical theism? Well, if you just take classical theism to be that we have a primary cause, pure actuality, which is utterly simple, eternal, good, and so on and so forth, and it's that from which all things come to be, then it's not threatening to that classical theism. Is it threatening to Catholicism? Well, yes, because Catholicism holds that there is a beginning to creation, that there were a finite number of changing things in the past, such that there was a point at which finite things began to be. So that there's a first finite thing. Now, so Catholicism affirms that there is a beginning to creation. That's not the same as saying that, there is a primary cause which grants existence to things. Obviously, Catholicism affirms that as well. But to say that there was a beginning to creation is just to say that there is some point in the past at which things began to be, some finite point. And Catholicism affirms that. That's the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, Thomas argues that is a revealed truth. He holds that whilst an eternally created universe is possible, there are no good arguments for there actually being an eternally created universe. And he also holds that whilst a finite universe with some beginning point is also possible, he holds again that there's no convincing arguments for that either. So he says it's basically a stalemate, on what the positive arguments can establish. So both of them are possible and both fit within a classical theistic metaphysics, but he holds that it's revelation, which tells us that there's a beginning to the universe. And this stands to reason because when we think about it, whether or not there's a beginning to creation or a beginning to the universe, it's something, it pertains to whether or not God wants to create a finite number of changing things or an infinite number of changing things. And so that pertains to what God wants or wills in creation. Now, the only way we can know the internal sort of constitution of God's will is if he chooses to reveal it to us. And so, if we take scripture seriously, and we take the Catholic reading of scripture seriously, then we take it that scripture has revealed what God wills for creation, and that's at a finite point in the past, things began to be, certain things began to be, and we've had this sort of progress through time up to now. So it's a revealed truth of faith, de fide, for all Catholics, because it pertains to the inner constitution of God's will.
Right.
So
yes.
That's it?
Yeah, that's good because it answers the next question, right? Do you think that the universe has always existed? Obviously not, as a faithful Catholic.
Yeah. So as a faithful Catholic, I accept, and given the gift of faith, I'm disposed to accept the things which are revealed by God in Scripture, precisely because it's God who revealed them.
Yeah.
Given that God is true and omniscient and all that, he knows exactly what he's revealing. And, I think as you yourself, magisterially demonstrated on Pat Flynn's show, that God guides his church. I'm happy enough to accept that, there was a beginning to creation in the past.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Gavin. So I'm interested in your thoughts then about, like, let's say, Rob Kuhn's and Alex Pruse's grim messenger paradox. If you're familiar with that, like, what are your do you think that establishes the finitude of the past?
So what's the grim messenger paradox? I read a blog post on this a while back, but I haven't really engaged with that in too much depth.
Yeah. So the idea is basically, suppose that from this present moment, there was, let's say T-1, a grim messenger who's going to receive a message from another grim messenger T-1, right? And we go on and on and on back into the past, right? So it's, instead of like successive addition, it's kind of like successive subtraction, right? Where we just go further back into the past, and then we go infinitely. And the idea is that, okay, each of the messengers are passing on the message to the next member, and it's an infinite set of members, right?
Yeah.
So I think I might be butchering this, but the idea is that there's a contradiction posed in this scenario, because we know that at some point, like if there is the present and we're waiting for these messengers to come to us, that the message ought to come to us, right, eventually, or something like that. But then can we say which member has the message? No. Or that sort of thing. So it's like, we know that's supposed to come to us, but we don't know where it is. You can't possibly put your finger on it.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, so that kind of argument to establish the finitude of the past is it's a very popular one. So obviously the grim messenger one is Kuhn's and Proust there that you're discussing.
Yeah.
But that strategy of argumentation, Thomas was well aware of that, and it stretches right back into the sort of the history of philosophy. I think you can even find versions of it in John Philoponus. Certainly, I think it was present in some of the Islamic philosophers, and it all turns on what you think of actual and potential infinites, whether or not an infinity is actual or potential. And it actually goes right back to Zeno's paradoxes and how Aristotle responds to Zeno's paradoxes, because you remember the tortoise and the hare. The hare gives the tortoise the head start, and then the hare has to try and catch up with the tortoise. But in order to take the first step, the hare has to take half a step, but to take half a step, it has to take a quarter, and so on and so on and so on. So it has to move through an infinite number of stages before it can even take one step to catch up with the tortoise. And it seems there's something similar happening here. There seems to be an infinite number of steps from the past that you kind of have to get through to get the message along to some point. So no matter what point in the past that the message is found, it will have to progress through an infinite number of points, and you can't progress through an infinity. So it seems it seems that it's an impossibility for the message to be at any point.
Yeah.
And if I'm understanding the analogy correctly, that's absurd, because the message has reached a point, and so there must be a finitude to the past. Okay, so well, going back to Aristotle, his solution to that Zeno paradox is that the line, the steps, or the points is potentially infinite, but actually finite at any one point. So he distinguishes between an actual and potential infinite. So the actual points that the hare has to cross are only finite, 1 foot, 2 foot, or whatever. But they're potentially infinite because, a line is potentially infinitely divisible. But they're not actually finite. Or they're not actually infinite. So there's no problem crossing something which is actually finite, but potentially infinite. And Thomas has a take on this with regard to the infinity of the past. So these sorts of objections were made to Thomas with regard to the infinity of the past, that you would have to have crossed through an infinite series to, an infinite number of days or rotations, of the planets or something like that, to have gotten to this point. So a bit like the message, it would have had to have gone through an infinite number of, hands, to get to any point along the lines. Thomas's solution to that is like, look, if you have a successive infinity, it's potentially infinite, but it's only actually finite. So take a series of fathers and sons. At any one point, it's only actually finite. You have a father who produces a son, he passes away, produces a son, or you could go back and keep going back. So there is only actually an infinite, and there is only an actual finitude of members, but the series is potentially finite because through succession, subsequent members, replace older members. So that's certainly intelligible, and that's certainly possible. So it could be the case, let's just replace the fathers and sons with the messengers. And so as, a new messenger comes along, an old one, passes away, and that can keep going. And then you can just, sort of reverse that scenario. So it's still only actually finite. Somebody still has the message at some point in time, and we have reached that point in time, we could say. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, and I remember in the Grim Messenger paradox, there was also this idea that if the previous Reaper did not put his number on the card that's being passed, then the current Reaper would put his number on the card. Right. So then there was that extra component too of like, okay, yeah, things are actually being written down and passed on to each point, but same thing, right?
Yeah. Now that's a good twist, because that means now every new member is adding something to it. Yeah. And so at any point in the chain, you have like an infinite addition, because it's gone through an infinite number of points. Now that is a really interesting twist to a classic argument, which I think was it Avicenna. It's certainly an argument that Thomas treats of in several places, including the De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world. And it's this, that, okay, let's say we can recognize a potentially infinite series of human beings, of fathers and sons. Okay, so let's say that series never had a beginning. Well, here's the thing. Every one of those members has an immortal soul, okay, which survives its death. So as each previous member passes away, something of the previous member remains, which is the immortal soul. And that sounds like, the Grim Messenger, paradox here. Each previous member is leaving something behind, by adding to the message. So in Thomas's case, he's just considering, the immortal soul is left behind. So in the message case, you will have an infinity of additions to the message. Or in the case that Thomas is considering, you'll have an infinity of immortal souls. Thomas's answer to that is that, well, look, okay, you'll have an infinity of immortal souls, and that'll be an actual infinity. But those immortal souls aren't essentially, they're not per se ordered to each other. They're only per accidence ordered to each other. So it's not a per accidence. It's not a per se causal series, which requires there to be some sort of primary cause. It's only a per accidence causal series. All the souls together, they don't form an entire integrated system.
Yeah.
which Thomas takes to be a bad actual infinite. It's an actual per accidens infinite, for which he grants the possibility. So I haven't read the Kuhn's and Proust case, so I don't want to comment on it too much.
Yeah.
But mutatis mutandis, if Thomas's solution there, that an infinite actual per accident, if an actual per accidens infinity is fine, then I imagine a similar sort of approach can be taken to the Kuhn's and Proust case. But I haven't actually read the case, so I don't want to, I could just be getting it completely wrong.
No, and I mean, like, what was it? The first articulation that I gave that was actually the Grim Reaper. Well, more like the Grim Reaper paradox, which is what Proust and Kuhn's developed on, right? That was closer to that. But the addition of like the note writing, and then like the Reaper, if the previous member didn't write, then he'll write his name on it or whatever. That's the important thing, right? That was the key twist for their argument.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, and I think you and I both noticed that makes a big difference in a way. That little twist.
Yeah. Because I mean that's a repetition then of a classical argument for the finitude of the past, which Thomas did consider. So that will turn on whether or not you think an actual infinite, which is per accidens ordered, is possible or not.
That's right. Yeah. And I think like in their paper on it, they talk about like I think the main objection they consider was like if you're a neo-Humean and you think that nothing can happen unless it happens somewhere in the timeline in the first place, right? So you have to consider the totality of the set before you consider what the individual members can do or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, I wouldn't take that neo-Humean approach.
Yeah.
Anyway, but one could still argue that an actually infinite per accidens infinity is fine because the members aren't per se ordered to each other. So we don't need to seek an account, for how any sort of causality gets into the system. And so it could just be that you have, a per accidens infinity just dispersed out. But I don't want to prejudice, because since I haven't read the paper,
Sure.
I could just be getting it wrong. Sorry.
No, that's fine. So then moving on, then I just want to have one more question, and then we'll move on to the rest of the docket. So, for instance, someone might say, okay, well, Gaven or St. Thomas, you're speaking in the place of St. Thomas, right? Let's in persona Thomas, right?
Oh God, right? Okay.
No, I'm kidding.
Kuhn's is a Thomas as well. A very good Thomas.
Yeah, he's a big boy, right? He can handle it too.
Yeah.
But Gaven, I mean, suppose that someone says, well, look, if St. Thomas is okay with an infinite regress in the past, why can't he be okay with an infinite, let's say, per se series? So each of the series is just, infinitely going down. There's no primary, cause.
Yeah. Because the nature of the per se series is that the members of the series don't have the causality of the series in virtue of what they are. So classic example, the hand, stick, and the stone. They don't have the motion of the series in virtue of being hands, sticks, and stones. They're essentially immobile. And so they're dependent on something to grant them motion, which thing grants them motion, say, is the agent, who can move things in virtue of what it is. And that's just what it is to be a per se series. It's to be dependent for causality on some cause. So, and that cause then is the cause of the causality of the series. It originates the causality in the series. So if you take away the cause of that causality, then the series just collapses as a causal series. The hand, the stick, and the stone aren't moved unless for the mental agent. So given that's the metaphysics of per se series, then we just look at existence as a causal property. Is existence a feature of things in the way that the motion of the hand, stick, and stone is a feature of those things? Well, the motion of the hand, stick, and stone is not possessed by the things in virtue of what they are, i.e. it's not possessed essentially. Given the distinction of essence and existence, existence isn't possessed essentially by things. So existence then is a kind of causality locatable in a per se ordered series. And the question then is, what is the cause of that causality, i.e. what is the cause of existence? It can't just be another essence existence composite, because then, that would be just like having, the hands, the stick, another stick, and a stone. Or it would just be another one of those members. the possession of which causality brings about the question in the first place. Where does that causality come from? And even if you had an infinite number of them, you still wouldn't have an explanation of how they came to have causality anyway. You would just have the causality presupposed in the series without an explanation. And so that's what calls then for a primary cause of the causality, which possesses the causality in virtue of what it is. It's able to originate it, such as the mental agent in the hand, stick, stone example, or in this case, something whose essence is its existence. So that's why per series can't just go infinitely.
Yeah. Because the idea is that if because existence is the sort of thing that is not had by creatures by virtue of what they are. If you just continue positing, let's say infinite creatures, then that doesn't actually do anything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like me. I don't know, to use an example, right? But let's say I say, hey, Gavin, I'm sending you thoughts and prayers, right? And then millions of people do it. And then it's like, well, it wasn't in the will of God, so to speak. And it's like, well, no matter how many times we do it, that doesn't mean that it's going to add anything, right? So to speak.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's not the best analogy, but do you see what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah. So, the point is that even if you just multiplied such things to infinity, you would have an infinite number of things dependent for their causality with nothing on which to depend.
Yeah. A million things doing nothing.
Yeah. Well,
on their own,
they would be dependent for that causality, but there would be nothing to cause that causality, because there would be no primary cause, which is primary precisely because it originates the causality, not because it comes first or anything like that,
right.
but it's that on which they depend for the causality in question.
All right. So then just moving on then to the last three questions. So we spent a long time on creation, but it's a really fun subject.
Yeah.
When we think about secondary causality, I think there's a question on first, what is secondary causality and how do you marry it with God's primary causality, his universal causality, right? Without espousing occasionalism. How do you avoid that?
Yeah. So, it's good that we finished up there on per se ordered series, because it's understanding the metaphysics of that series where we can understand secondary or instrumental causality. So if you take the hand, the stick, and the stone, again, let's take the hand and the stick, and then the stone is what is moved, okay? So the hand and the stick are essentially immobile, okay? So in virtue of what they are, they're not mobile, okay? They are subject to motion, of course, but they don't move because of themselves. Rather, they move because something gives them motion, brings about the reality of motion in them. So the mental agent, let's say, use the golf example. The golf player induces his hands to move the club to hit the ball. Okay. Now the golf player is the primary cause there, precisely because he originates the causality in the series. Without him, there would be no such causality in the series, or unless you replace him with some other sort of primary cause which can originate causality. The hands and the club, they would be immobile. Now, the hands and the club, they're secondary causes because they cannot cause without participating in the causality that the golf player grants to them. So they only cause in virtue of the causality which they derive from the golf player. So their causality is secondary because it's a participated causality specified to the hands and to the club. So the hands move in the way that the hands move, and the club moves in the way that the club moves. So those secondary causes, they take the causality that they get from the primary cause and they specify it in some sort of way. That being the case, then, it's not just that the primary cause, the golf player, is acting. The hands are also acting, and the club is also acting to hit the ball. It's just the case that there's a hierarchy then of causes such that the primary cause is making use of the hands to move the club to hit the ball. Okay, so that means then that occasionalism is avoided, because occasionalism holds that what you would call secondary causes, what we would call secondary causes, is really nothing more than the occasion for the primary cause to bring something about. Okay, whereas on this account of primary and secondary causality, the hands are moving and the club is moving, but they're moving in virtue of the golf player moving them. It's not the case that the hands aren't moving, and in reality, the golf player, through, some sort of Jedi trick, is moving the clubs, and just making it look like the hands are moving the clubs, or that, you know, it's not the case that the club isn't moving and the ball just moves by virtue of the primary cause, and he just makes it look like the club moves. It's a fact that the hands and the club do actually move, and they move because of the golf player. So on this, you know, ordered hierarchy of causality, because the secondary members participate in the causality of the primary cause, they themselves are genuine, albeit secondary or instrumental causes, whereas occasionalism denies that anything other than the primary cause does exercise any kind of causality. Rather, it's just illusory. What we take to be a cause other than the primary cause is just the occasion for the primary cause doing something. So I think that's how we avoid occasionalism.
Yeah, so it's keeping the distinction there between like the creature and the creator, but also saying that the actions of the creature are intrinsic or real to it, right? Like it's
Yeah.
not illusory causation. So, I mean,
Yeah.
like one good example of this might be like a father pushing a daughter on a bike. You know, let's say like this daughter, she can't on her own start the bike, but she needs help. So the father pushes the bike. He gives this deposit of motion, let's say. And then the
Yeah.
daughter takes that motion and specifies it into the pedals
Yeah.
such that she can go somewhere with it. And it's
Yeah.
really her that is
Yeah.
moving and specifying the motion, but she's
Yeah.
not the source of the motion.
Exactly. So, you know, creatures do engage in activity, and it's a real activity because it's a real actuality the creatures have. Every creature has its own individual active existence in virtue of which it can be and thereby act in the world. But that's a participated active existence, which it derives from God as primary cause. So creatures as secondary causes are real causes, but they only have that causal actuality because they participate in the existence which is granted to them from the primary cause. So like your bike example, there is real motion in the girl on the bike, but it's real motion that the girl only has because of the motion that the father, say, imparts to her. And that's just another take on the, you know, the hand stick stone example.
Right. Yeah. So then now getting to these last few questions about creation. So, you know, I mean, when you posted, I think it was in the Thomism discussion group that St. Thomas already wrote about existential inertia. You know, I was kind of like, no, there's no way, right? And then I clicked on the link that you posted and I saw St. Thomas literally says it would appear as if things exist or persist on their own, right, without needing a sustaining cause. I'm like, oh wait, no, he knew this. So what did he say about existential inertia, and where can we find this? Is it in the Summa Contra Gentiles? Where is it?
Yeah. So I mean, the reaction against existential inertia from Aristotelians in general, and then Thomas in particular, is part and parcel of a rejection that things exist because of their intrinsic constituent principles. So it's a reaction against atomism, really, that there are these, you know, fundamental components which are really inside the thing, and that so long as those components remain together, the thing will remain. And then if you get an agent which can come along and just break down these atomic components, it'll end up preventing the existence of the thing. So on this account, existence is an emergent feature of the thing, which the thing has in virtue of kind of, you know, being put together by some fundamental components such as atoms. So really the reaction against existential inertia is a rejection of that outlook, that existence isn't something secondary or emergent, but it's something primary. It's the condition for there being anything at all, any substance at all. So things don't exist just because they're components are conjoined, even necessarily conjoined, or you know, remain conjoined in a certain way. Rather, the components themselves of things would not be unless they came to participate in an active existence. So that as soon as they stop participating in that active existence, they cease to be. And where does that active existence come from? How do things come to participate in the active existence? Well, it's through God granting existence to them. But in granting existence to things, God isn't putting like an atom inside the thing by which it's generated, almost as if it's a holograph. Rather, again, it's like the illumination of the atmosphere by the sun. So long as the sun keeps shining, the atmosphere keeps illuminating. You take away the sun and the atmosphere is no longer illuminated. And so in that De Potentia text, question 5, I think. Notably, in the first article, Thomas goes through a lot of different arguments from the philosophy of nature from this. But in reply to the 6th objection, he makes several key distinctions which are important here, which help illuminate his views on existential inertia. He says, you can have a form existing in the thing, which form is perfect both in nature and in being. And so that form will remain in the thing, perfect in nature and in being, because there are no contrary nature, there are no contrary principles in the matter by which the form will cease to be in the matter. So think of our substantial form, the rational soul of the human, or the substantial form of anything. It is composed of prime matter. It produces a substance, and it just remains in the substance until it decomposes, basically, until there's a severing of this, until there's a transformation. Okay, so there's no contrary principles in prime matter which pushes the substantial form out of it. So that's one case. On another case, you have a form which is perfect in nature but not perfect in being, and he gives the example of heat here, that the form of heat exists in the matter of the substance, let's say an iron or something like that, but it doesn't exist perfectly because the matter of the iron has contrary principles which in a sense push the heat out of it, say a disposition to cool or something like that, a disposition to lose heat. So the heat doesn't take root in the iron is the idea. And then you have forms which are imperfect in nature and imperfect in being, which just will not be in the thing at all unless the thing comes to participate in the causality of something which grants that to the thing. And he gives the example of, illumination here. And he also gives the example of a mirror, that the image would not be in the mirror unless, you had the body before the mirror casting the image. Now think about that. The body isn't in the actual mirror, but it causes the image to be in the mirror. And that's kind of like your illumination of the atmosphere example. The atmosphere just comes to participate in the illumination by the sun. And that's how existence relates to the thing which participates in existence. That as soon as you take away the cause which grants existence to the thing just loses its existence entirely. So conversely then, a thing would not exist unless it participated for its existence at every moment that it exists, just as the atmosphere would not be illuminated unless it stands in a relationship to the light of the sun. There's creation again as a relation there from the creature. So unless the creature stands in a relationship of being effect to God's act of creation, it just simply would not be. So in themselves, creatures are nothing. The essence of a creature doesn't exist in virtue of what it is. So in itself, it is nothing. And so it can only be something so long as it participates in the causal activity of God, granting it existence. So existence isn't like an atom or a thing or a component stuck inside the substance by which it remains. And then another, sort of agent can come along and just take it out. That's not how existence works in things. Existence is a condition for there being anything at all.
Right. This reminds me of, Rob Koons and Alex Proust. They wrote in Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives on Contemporary Science, basically, that contemporary science also vindicates, especially quantum theory, that, the atomistic picture of the world, the mechanistic philosophy that arose is just wrong. You can't say that you have to start with the parts to get to the whole. You have to begin with the whole to make sense of the parts.
Exactly.
In that way. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's been well known for quite a while, philosophically speaking, that there's just a problem with mechanistic atomism. That if you build the whole up out of the parts, then the whole is nothing but an aggregate of the parts. And so, how do we account for features of the whole which the parts don't have? Leibniz was well aware of that, and Leibniz thought, well, we have to revert to some sort of an account of substantial form. That there is some sort of monad, which is the substantial monad of the whole. So, he tries to go back to that, but it's a well-known issue for mechanistic atomism. And, it's not just Koons,
Right.
that brings that out. There's a number of different authors bring that out.
Right. So then basically, if you can get the per se series correct, if you understand it properly, and if you reject atomism and
Mhm,
mechanistic atomism, then you can
mhm.
just say you can just say be gone, right? With
Yeah,
existential inertia.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the point is that existential inertia is implausible on this metaphysics. Uh, so there's no reason why it needs to be entertained as as an ongoing concern, precisely because it just doesn't fit in that metaphysical system. The only reason to entertain it is if somebody raises it as an objection, and then the response is that, well, look, here's the metaphysics of the matter, and that's why that objection doesn't occur. It's a very Wittgensteinian move, that you don't have to address the objection directly. You just need to show where the philosophical misunderstandings have occurred, which made that objection seem plausible.
Yeah.
It's the same with skepticism. It's the traditional Macdolian, McDowell's response to Cartesian skepticism, that you don't have to address skepticism head on. You just have to address the philosophical misunderstandings that have occurred, which would make skepticism seem urgent,
Hmm.
when really it's not urgent. And given that, Thomists have provided, good, robust defenses of Thomistic metaphysics, we need to see what's wrong with those defenses of the Thomistic metaphysics to see why existential inertia would even be plausible.
Yeah, I totally agree. So now we can get to the last question on creation. And this actually segues nicely into the next topic, which we can spend, 20, 30 minutes on, whatever works for you, Gavin.
Cool.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, so what is then the final end of creation?
Mm,
What is the reason behind the
mm,
the efficient causation, or the start of this whole thing?
yeah.
And I guess one question to add too is, this idea of exitus redditus,
Mm,
where all things that come from God will in some sense return to God. Where
yeah.
does that what does that come what is that concept? Where does it come from? And
Mm,
does this entail universal salvation?
mhm.
There goes your easy question for the night. No, I was kidding.
Okay. Yeah. So I addressed this issue in the last chapter of my creation book. And there's a really interesting story about how I came to write that last chapter. But I'll tell you basically just the common thread, the common argument of the last chapter. And then you can ask about the story of how I came to write it afterwards. But the idea here is that we typically think of creation, or God's being the primary cause, in terms of what you could call efficient causality, that God imparts existence to things. Um, and we think of the per se ordered series like that. The mind moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone, and then we transfer that to the case of existence. We have some primary cause whose essence is its existence, granting existence to things. But we can also interpret the per se ordered series in terms of final causality. That, the golf player moves his hands to move the stick to move the ball. And then we ask, why? Why does he do that? Well, let's say, I use the case of Dr. Smith. I say, he works in a department, and his dean likes golf, and the possibility of promotion is coming up. So the Dr. Smith moves his hands to move the club, to move the ball, in order to improve his swing, in order to get a promotion. And so what we start seeing now is that we're getting an ordered series of final causes, whereas before we had an ordered series of efficient causes, club, hands to golf player. Now we're getting, Dr. Smith's in order to improve his swing, in order to get a promotion. Well, why does he want a promotion? In order for a bigger salary. Why that? In order for a bigger house. Why that? In order to have a family and children and live happily ever after, and so on and so on and so on. So the point there is that just as you construct an ordered series in terms of efficient causes, you can construct an ordered series in terms of final causes. And note also that each of those final causes does not possess the causality of finality in itself. So what's Dr. Smith's in order to? Well, his initial final cause is to improve his swing. What's that in order to? Well, something greater, to get a promotion. What's that in order to? Something greater, and so on and so on. None of those final causes has the nature of finality in itself. There's always a further in order to. So just as in the essentially ordered series where it's efficient causality, none of the members of the series have the causality in themselves in virtue of what they are, so none of the final causes has the causality of finality in themselves in virtue of what they are. So unless you have a primary final cause in virtue of which all of those secondary final causes have the causality of finality, you would have no finality in the Dr. Smith series. The primary efficient cause, Dr. Smith, wouldn't exercise his causality in order to do something. So there would just be no finality of the series. Now, what is a primary final cause? It'll be the essence of finality. Okay, it'll be that which all desire. Okay, that which all seek, which is the good. All right. So Dr. Smith pursues, his course of action in order to improve his swing. He thinks that would be a good thing. Why? In order for a promotion, he thinks that would be good. Why? To buy a bigger house. He thinks that would be good. Why? And so everything, all the reasons he does it for, because he thinks it would be a good thing. So ultimately then, the primary final cause is going to be the essence of finality itself. It's going to be goodness itself. Okay. So the ultimate final cause is going to be the good. And the primary efficient cause without which there would be nothing is pure existence itself. So the primary efficient cause, pure existence itself, exercises its causality for the good itself, for the ultimate good itself, which is, just the ultimate goal of what it's doing. Now, the thing here is that insofar as God is pure existence itself, there's nothing outside of him which is good for him, which actualizes him in any way, to which he is subject for his being. So there's nothing outside of him which is good for him. Yet, insofar as everything depends on him, he is the good of everything else. In other words, God is the good itself. In being pure existence itself, God is the good itself. So he exercises his causality for the sake of the good, which he himself is. Now, as we were talking earlier, he's not necessitated to do so. He can just enjoy the goodness that he himself is without granting existence to creatures. But insofar as he does grant existence to creatures, he grants them the goodness. He allows them to enjoy the goodness that he himself is because he wants to. He wants them to enjoy that goodness. So he creates creatures for the sake of that goodness, that they may enjoy it. So God then is not only the primary cause insofar as all creatures come from him, they come from him in order to enjoy the goodness that he himself is. So they reach their perfection in him. Okay, so the good of all creatures is found in God. Now, that doesn't mean that every creature is going to, get to heaven and enjoy God. My dog that we had to put down, my beloved dog, my Shih Tzu, we had to have him put down, several months ago. He's not currently with God at the minute. He's gone. He's dead. The point is that insofar as, creatures, their goodness or their perfection is in God, they will be perfected as the kind of creatures that they are. My dog will be perfected as a dog. So how will that perfection lie in God? Well, because, my dog is actualized in its existence as a dog from God, by God's granting existence to it. That is its goodness. So we have all these different creatures, and their goodness lies in God through his granting of existence or of esse, of actuality to them. But we get to the human creature. The good of the human creature is a bit funny. Humans are the high point of all creation. They're the most intense manifestation of God's creativity. Why is this? Because on the physical side of things, humans manifest every level of physical existence. You have inanimate things, which are just physical. Humans are physical. You have living things, which are not only physical, but they're alive. Humans are alive. Then you have the different degrees of life. You have nutritive life, sensitive life, and rational life. Humans enjoy all those levels of life, and so they enjoy all levels of physical existence. So in the human being, every degree of physical existence is found. Also in the human being, spiritual existence is found, because human beings have intellect and will. So human beings unite both spiritual reality and every degree of physical existence. So all degrees of being are found in the human being as united. So human beings have an even greater level of being than the angels, because the angels don't manifest physical being. They only manifest immaterial being, spiritual being, whereas the human being unites both. As Thomas says, that the human being is a horizon between the spiritual and the physical, between the immaterial and the material. So in the human being then is the greatest, most intense manifestation of God's creativity. So human beings are the highest level of creatures. So with the perfection of creatures comes with the perfection of humans comes the perfection of creation. Now, how will human beings be perfected as the kind of things that they are? If we perfect the highest in human beings, the lower is perfected. So if a human being's rational nature is perfected, then the rest of the human being will be perfected. And how is it perfected? Well, the human intellect and human will seeks out what is true and wills what is good. God is the truth itself and goodness itself. So the human being, the human creature, will be perfected through seeing God as he is in his essence, both as the true and as the good. And with that, there will be the perfection of creation. But we have the tragedy of sin. I think Chesterton said original sin is the only, Christian dogma that you can really offer definitive proof for, because everybody is aware of original sin, the darkening of the intellect and the weakening of the will. So you have that fall from grace. Human beings no longer enjoy communion with God because of that. It's like, when we were in that Edenic paradise, we were standing in the light of the sun, and then through the choices of our first parents, we step out of the light of the sun and we're in the shade. And then everybody born after that is born in the shade, shaded from God's grace. And so, that's the original sin and, kind of the inheritance of original sin. So since then, nobody has been able to enjoy God's grace. So human beings, in order to be perfected, they need to, enjoy communion with God, by means of which they can see God in his essence as the true and the good itself, by means of which they'll be perfected. But we've lost that. Nevertheless, God's good creation, the high point of which human beings, is the greatest manifestation of his creativity, has been defaced in some sort of way. And so we have this rescue operation whereby God undertakes to bring human beings back to himself. And that's what the incarnation is. That's what Christ's incarnation is. That God goes looking for humans like the good shepherd. All the non, sort of Judeo-Christian religions have human beings looking and trying to find God, and God is lost and we're trying to find God. But the decisive uniqueness to the Judeo-Christian outlook and the originality of it is that it's human beings which are lost, and God is trying to find us to bring us back. Hence, all the good shepherd, parables in the Gospels, and the thinking of God as a shepherd who looks after his people. So God becomes incarnate in order to bring humanity back to God, so that they can enjoy communion with God and the vision with God once again. And so Christ, as the Word of God, manifests God to humans, teaches them the truth about God, and brings, the goodness, the good news of salvation to them. And so it's through the grace merited through Christ that human beings can, enjoy communion and eternal life with God. But insofar as we've lost that Edenic state, we're still subject to death. The wages of sin is death. We're cut off from God's grace. We're not naturally, we're not like Platonic, minds or anything like that. We're not naturally immortal. We can only live by God's grace. And so we're still subject to death. And thus we have the resurrection. That Christ's resurrection is, first of all, it's a testimony to who Christ was in his divine nature, but it's also a manifestation of what Christ has, of what our future state will be like, so long as we participate in the grace that Christ merits for us. And so we will enjoy the resurrection, and then enjoying the resurrection, we will enjoy the vision of God in his essence, and so we'll be returned to perfection. We'll be made perfect, and through being made perfect, all of creation will be made perfect. So creation is made complete then fundamentally through Christ, through the incarnation of the Word, because it's at that point then that human nature is perfected, and as the high point of creation, all creation is perfected, and has its return to God, has its consummation in God through that. So that's just a kind of a general précis of the final chapter of the book.
Hmm.
Do you want
Well,
to? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm just interested though. Like, does your vision then entail that all must be saved, or all will be dragged into this final state of perfection?
Not exactly, because you take my dog, the perfection of my dog. My dog won't be perfected as a human being or as an angel. It will be perfected as a dog. Okay, so
Right.
it'll not be contrary to the nature of my dog to grant my dog. It would be contrary to my dog's nature to grant my dog eternal life, because it's just
Hmm.
not it's just not part of the nature of my dog to enjoy communion and beatitude with God. So God does not perfect things contrary to the nature of the thing. He only perfects things in accord with its nature.
Right.
Now, when it comes to human beings, God doesn't perfect things. The human being, God doesn't save the human being against its will. If the human being wants to be saved, well, fair play. God's like, wonderful, right? Christ became incarnate. We've had that. That's all occurred, and this grace is freely given. But if the human being doesn't want to be saved, well, the human being doesn't want to be saved, and not even God in His omnipotence can force the human being to be saved if the human being doesn't want to be saved. So if the human being turns his or her back on the grace of God, well then he's not disposed to receiving the grace by
Hmm.
which he can be saved, and so salvation doesn't occur for that human.
Right, because the idea here is that with secondary causality, what makes that agent who they are is the
Mhm.
reality of their will. Well, at least for the human
Mhm.
agent, right? It's the reality
Yeah.
of their causal activity. So if they
Mhm.
choose from their will not to
Mhm.
believe in God or not to submit to him, let's say,
Yeah.
then like that is the secondary causal reality of the agent. So
Mhm.
then the reality that
Yeah.
follows from that is everlasting death, basically. Right.
Yeah. Well, a lack of salvation.
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
Hmm.
an inability to participate in salvation, precisely because of a refusal to accept the grace by which salvation can occur,
Yeah. All right.
uh, which is
So,
unfortunate. But there
mhm.
you go. Yeah.
Right. So then to the last question then, just about the resurrection, right? So
Mm,
I noticed that you were reading a lot of books on the resurrection, and you said you were actually going to write a book yourself
yeah.
about it. So
Started writing a book. Yeah.
right. So tell me, like, what aspect of the resurrection are you going to write on? What are you studying at the moment?
Yeah. So when I first wrote the creation book, I thought, God, I've bitten off a lot more than I can chew here. The De Essentia book, that was just one paragraph of one wee treatise, and it was straightforward enough to knock that out. And then when I wrote the creation book, I thought, God, there's quite a bit to try and draw and synthesize together here. And I thought, God, I've bitten off quite a bit here, but I stuck with it and I got the creation book done. And if the creation book, if a bit an awful lot that it could chew with the creation book, I mean, it's just in a different stratosphere now with the resurrection book. But in any case, I'm doing the research and I'm writing this book on the resurrection. Currently, what I've been doing a lot of reading on is the stuff that I'm either not so expert on, or that I did engage with, a while in the past, but I've since kind of went on the pastures anew, so I need to refamiliarize myself with it. So that's the stuff that I'm boning up on at the minute is are the different sort of scriptural commentaries on the resurrection. So I've been getting into scripture, and I've been getting into the study of sacred scripture, and the views of different authors with regard to what scripture tells us about the resurrection. So that's one thing which I haven't had an initial expertise on, and I've had to engage in a steep learning curve just on the hermeneutics of scripture. On the other hand, the sort of issues that I did engage with quite a bit in the past, but for the past number of years I haven't, has been the epistemology of faith, the nature of faith as a virtue, as a theological virtue, and the different sort of cognitive issues which are involved in the act of faith. I used to engage with that stuff quite a bit, but given different research interests and different teaching needs, I just haven't engaged with it as much. So I've kind of had to refresh myself on a whole lot of that stuff. And what I've been doing at the minute, I haven't been writing on the scripture at the minute. I've just been, sort of, going over the scripture and the different commentaries and stuff. There's an awful lot there. I've just been gathering information on that, but I've been writing at the minute on the act of faith, the nature of faith, as Aquinas thinks of it. And now I'm gathering materials to write a comparative account with other views on faith, particularly the Reformed epistemologists. So I haven't I haven't done enough research yet on the Reformed epistemologists to write that comparison. So that's waiting in the wings. And just kind of with work and different research projects, different articles that I have to get off. The research in that is kind of stalled for a bit while I just meet several deadlines I have at the minute. But that's not to say writing on the resurrection book isn't going forward, because in order to save time, I've started writing and putting pen to paper on the relation of body and soul, the nature of body and soul, the survival of the soul after death, how body and soul are related, in the resurrection, and what we can, take that to imply for ourselves. So, and that stuff I know. That stuff I'm pretty comfortable with and pretty at ease with, because that's just straight up metaphysical anthropology. And so I've been given a few lectures on that, the research seminars at the college at which I teach. I've been, I've written on this sort of stuff in the past, so I'm, regurgitating, some of my previous material, and that's what's taken my attention with this resurrection book at the minute, the body and soul stuff. Whereas the stuff on faith, because I'm having to do more research on it and gather materials. I'm kind of just reading and taking notes with that sort of stuff, but the writing at the minute is on the body and soul stuff.
Right. So are you going to cover the historicity of the resurrection at all, or whether or not it happened, or is that kind of not?
Yeah. I will write about that.
Okay, yeah.
A little bit, but not as much as, not as much as other authors do, the likes of Habermas, Lincona,
Yeah.
people like that. I think the reason being is that it seems to me that Habermas and Lincona, they're doing apologetics.
Yeah.
They are trying to make a case which will answer every single possible question that could come up in every single scenario that you could ever imagine occurring. What I'm more interested in is, well, look, given that you can have given that you can make a historically reliable judgment to the fact of the resurrection, or to the history of the resurrection, on the basis of the empty tomb and the different post-resurrection sightings and the different testimonies, where do we go from there? What can we do with that? Now, that's a significant question in itself. So I will be pointing out the way Gerald Collins and Morrison, people like that do, is that well, look, the testimonies are reliable, and the empty tomb is a good indicator for us to make the historical judgment that the resurrection, the fact of Christ's resurrection, best explains all these different data points. What that will require of me is to give a kind of philosophy of history, what historical investigation has to look like in order to come to that sort of judgment, because there's a certain account of history whereby the historian is conceived of as some sort of a detective, where the detective moves from evidence A to evidence B to evidence C to the ineluctable conclusion, the kind of the Sherlock Holmesian sort of thing, that you move from A to B to C, and ineluctably you're led to the conclusion. But given that the sort of premises of a historical judgment just don't appear like that, because history is messy, rather what we have to do is make a reasonable judgment as to what best explains all the evidence that we have. So I'm turning to Lonergan and Lonergan's account of judgment as reaching the virtually unconditioned, and applying that to judgments of history. At least that's what I plan to do. And I know Lonergan has written a bit about history and how the historian, has, as an investigator, has to act, and that's based on the cognitional process that he outlines in his big book Insight. It's in accord with that cognitional process of experience, the relevant data, and an intelligent grasp of the data, and a reasonable judgment about the data. And so my point will be that when it comes to the event of Christ's resurrection, you can make a reasonable and informed judgment that it did occur. Now, that doesn't speak to the act of faith in the resurrection as a promise of our future resurrection and the act of faith by means of which we're disposed to believe things which God has revealed because it's God who has revealed them. So it doesn't speak to that issue. It only speaks to the historical event of Christ's resurrection. So my sort of project in that respect is, are you aware of Matthew Levering's book on the resurrection of the Son of God?
Yeah. Is it by that title or because I know
Something like that.
Levering has written on the resurrection something
Mhm.
like I don't know, like I don't know the exact title, but yes, he's written on the resurrection. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the sort of case that he makes is not that, watertight apologist case that Habermas and Lencioni make, but it's more that you can make a historical judgment, and that historical judgment goes hand in hand with one's faith that one has to be disposed to believe the things that God has revealed because God has revealed them.
Hmm.
So it's an informed historical judgment which informs a critical act of faith.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have Lacona's book, by the way, on the resurrection of Jesus?
I don't have that one. I have the one that he co-authored with Gary Habermas.
Yeah, yeah. This book here, it's called The Resurrection of Jesus, a New
Mm-hmm.
Historiographical Approach. The
Mm-hmm.
first like 100 pages of this, well, I think it's his doctoral thesis, but he just kind of updated it. The first
Mm-hmm.
100 something pages is dealing with the philosophy of history.
Yeah.
So I think
Mm-hmm.
you would really appreciate this work because it's not
Yeah.
just apologetic, right? It's very
Mm-hmm.
academic, and I think you'd like it. But
Mm-hmm.
Gavin, if I could ask you, so to kind of wrap this up and ask you one last question.
Mm-hmm.
You said you talked about the metaphysics of the body and the soul. So
Mm-hmm.
on one hand, we emphasize that the soul is kind of like what unifies the substance in some sense, or
Mm-hmm.
is the
Yeah.
substance, right? So that kind of makes us sound like a materialist. Maybe like when we die, that's it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you talk
Yeah.
about the soul after death, right? So how do you
Mm-hmm.
make sense of that? And then the
Mm-hmm.
resurrection, right? So then the soul returns to the body. What
Mm-hmm.
is that? Can
Yeah.
you just talk about the metaphysics of death and
Yeah.
resurrection?
Yeah. Sure. So soul and body, the rational soul and the body, or just soul and body in general. So assuming holomorphism, okay, and all that goes with that, there is an exhaustive distinction between two different kinds of substances, living, and two different kinds of material substances, living and non-living substances. Now, insofar as they're both material substances, they're not distinguished as living or non-living substances because they're material. Rather, it must be the way in which the matter is structured or ordered or put together. So living and non-living things, they both have matter in common. So it's not by their matter that they're distinguished, but it's by the form that the matter takes, which distinguishes them. So animate things, living things then, have a special form which makes them alive, which non-living things don't have. And so we call that anima, Greek psyche, English the soul. So the soul then isn't this sort of Cartesian mind or Platonic separated thing. The soul is the form of the body, and the rational soul then is the form of the human body. So a human being is a composite of rational soul and body. Now, insofar as forms are individuated by the matter that they inform, okay, so matter is the principle of individuation. The rational soul then is individuated by the matter that it informs, which is the human body. So it's not the case that my rational soul has some sort of internal individual essence, which is me, which is Gaven. Rather, Gaven, my personal identity, is the personal identity of this living physical substance that you have, made alive by the rational soul. Nevertheless, the rational soul has two operations which don't depend on a material organ, intellect and will, with the will being the rational appetite. Now, given that it has these two operations which don't depend on a material organ, that arguments for that are well known. The idea is that the intellect has to stand in potency to all things intelligible, all material things are intelligible, so the intellect stands in potency to all material things, in which case it can't have the actuality of any material thing. So I mean that's the kind of flavor of argument that you get for the immateriality of the operation of intellect and in turn the will. Given that the rational soul has operations which don't depend on a material organ, so it's got immaterial operations, the rational soul itself, which has these operations, in virtue, which itself has these operations, can't be material either. Now, it's not an immaterial substance, but it's an immaterial form of a material substance. So given that the identity conditions of the rational soul and the body are distinct, the persistence conditions of body and soul are distinct. So that with the perishing of the body, the decomposition of the body, you don't get the perishing of the soul, precisely because the soul, as being immaterial, doesn't depend for its subsistence on the body. Nevertheless, that's not the person which survives the sundering of body and soul. It's only the soul of the person which survives. So the soul is individuated by the body. It's my soul, not individual in itself. So my soul isn't individual in itself. It's only individuated by the body. Nevertheless, after death, it retains its character as my soul. So all those different, intellectual dispositions that I have, and all those different dispositions of my will, is retained in my soul after death, so that it's genuinely mine. And that accounts for, part of the Catholic spiritual tradition. The character of your soul at the point of death will determine the fate of your soul for eternity. Because if the character of my soul is such that it's turned away and not accepting of God's grace, then I don't die in the arms of God. So my soul then doesn't, go off and, enjoy God's presence, go somewhere else. Okay, so you have the soul which exists in this intermediate state. But that's not a person that exists. It's just the soul of a person. So whilst the soul is existing in this intermediate state with God, it's lacking in something. Okay, there is something that it's without, which is its body. A soul, as a form of the body, seeks to be with its body. So that's not perfect beatitude for the soul, precisely because the soul is lacking in something and you don't have the person there. So in order for there to be perfection of the soul, there needs to be resurrection of the body. So then at the end of time, the final consummation after the final judgment, or with the final judgment, the soul reunites with its body. Now, because the soul retains its character that it had, that's my soul, which survives death, then in being reunited with the body, in forming matter, once again, the body which, is thus informed will be my body, because it's my soul that informs it. Okay. Now that's to deal with issues further down the line, well, what happens, if a cannibal eats me and then the cannibal dies, and, who gets which body, we can kind of just circumvent all of that, because the soul retains its individuation, so that whatever matter it informs, that matter then will be duly informed by the individuation which the soul has. So it'll be my body. And then if you want to get more spiritual and more technical, it'll be a 33-year-old perfect manifestation of me, because Christ was 33-year-old when he was resurrected. That's part of the whole spiritual tradition. So that's kind of the account, of body and soul, which is involved in this. An awful lot of unpacking needs to be done there. So that's going to occur over several chapters, but that's the general outlook, and that's the general view to take. Raises interesting issues with regard to the identity of Christ's body in the tomb after the events of Good Friday. If you want to get it, we can get into that if you want, but it does raise interesting issues.
Yeah, sure. We can close with that then, because I remember, what was it? The New Testament scholar Dale Allison, in his book Resurrecting Jesus, brilliant book, but he has a huge question in his mind about the identity of the body of Christ, and this question of the metaphysics of resurrection. So I think your book could very directly deal with what Dale Allison had questions about. I don't remember all the questions fully, but go ahead, Gavin, and tell us about the Lord.
Yeah. Well, let me root it in. This is something which was debated by the Dominicans and Franciscans in the Middle Ages. They debated everything. There's very rarely an issue in this sort of in these areas that wasn't debated in the medieval universities. You just need to know where to look, and you just need to kind of look hard enough. and just see that the same issues are being repeated. So there was this issue of the unity of substantial form. Aquinas and, eventually with him, the Dominicans afterwards. Of course, there were, Dominicans who didn't follow this, but in general, Aquinas and then the Dominican tradition afterwards held that a substance only has one substantial form, and that substantial form informs prime matter, and you have the substance. The Franciscans held that there's two, after St. Bonaventure and others, that there's two substantial forms, or there's two forms which constitute the substance. First of all, you have prime matter, and then prime matter receives the form of corporeity. So it makes the matter corporeal, and then the corporeal matter, the body, receives a substantial form, making it the sort of substance that it is. So for Aquinas, prime matter receives a substantial form. In the case of the human, it receives the rational soul, and thus you have the substance. Whereas for the Franciscan school, you have prime matter, which receives the form of corporeity, making it, a body. Then it receives the rational soul, making it a human being. Okay. Now, the beauty of the Franciscan approach really helped deal with the identity of Christ's body in the tomb, because on Aquinas' account, see, as soon as your body loses the rational soul, it's no longer a human body, okay? Because it's lost the rational soul. What it is, it's a collection of different substances, flesh, blood, bone, all of that, and, it very quickly starts to decay. So it's not a human body. So that's not my body. When I die, that's not my body, which will be left over after I'm dead. I will be gone. Only my soul, will have survived. But that isn't even really me. That's just the soul of me. Now, this raises a big issue for, the identity of Christ's body in the tomb, because that's Christ's body in the tomb, and that's the body that he takes back up again on Easter Sunday. How do we deal with that? Well, the Franciscans had a great way of dealing with that, because it's just that sort of second form, the rational soul, which has been severed from the body in the tomb, but the form of corporeity remains. Okay, so that remains, and so Christ can take that human body back up again on Easter Sunday. So they've got a nice solution to that. Aquinas' solution is, I think it's genius. Aquinas' solution is it's as follows. If Christ were just a human being, another human being, then yeah, that body in the tomb would not be a human body. But the thing is, Christ isn't just a human being. Christ's human nature is united to the second person of the Trinity, the person of the Word. Okay? Now, in being united to the second person of the Trinity, that human nature can only be disunited from the person of the Word through the will of the person of the Word himself. Okay? He is the one that took up that human nature and united it to himself. So he's the one who can kind of sever what's called the hypostatic union. The severing of body and soul, of Christ's body and soul on the cross, does not sever the union of the human nature with the person of the Word. The body and the soul still remain united to the Word, but the body and soul remain disunited from each other. So insofar as body and soul still remain united to the Word, but disunited from each other, they're still the body and soul of the person, which is the Word, okay, of the person of Christ, which is the Word, the second person of the Trinity. So it's still his body and soul, which which body he takes up again on Easter Sunday. And in the time in the tomb, his soul is, sojourning. We say sojourning in hell. Okay, so he's breaking the limbo of the fathers and freeing all those in Abraham's bosom. He's preaching, as St. Peter says, he's preaching to those, in prison. But in any case, that's Aquinas' solution to that the body and soul remain united to the person of the Word. They never become disunited to the person, but they're disunited from each other. So that when the person of the Word takes up that body again, the body and soul are just reunited with each other, but they've always been united hypostatically to the Word. And that's Aquinas' solution to that, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. So then, I have maybe another question that this came up, but, for instance, let's say Christ's body is a very unique case, but let's say my body is burned up, or I don't know, maybe
Mm.
like the graveyard that I'm in just fades away
Mm.
from existence, and then
Yeah,
my body just becomes one with the ground, or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Like, so then, how would I, like, would my rational soul kind of just get reanimated, or reunited with some random piece of matter? Like, how does that work? Or, like,
Mm. Yeah,
what model should we
yeah,
propose for that?
yeah. So what I'm going to argue is that insofar as the rational soul retains its character, God just has to unite that rational soul with matter. It doesn't have to be the same continuous matter that you had here on earth. It just has to be matter. And because the rational soul retains its individuation, the matter with which it is united will be informed by the individuated rational soul, which is your soul. So it'll be your body then that results from that.
All right, yeah, that makes sense to me. So then, okay, I got to ask you about this too. I'm sorry, it came up, but you
Okay.
said, like, in the Catholic spiritual tradition, we'll be
Yeah.
33 when we're resurrected, like, age wise, right? So, like,
Yeah, I've come across that. Yeah.
right. So is this like, suppose, like, I'm 33 and I'm, like, obese and just not taking care
Yeah.
of myself. Am I gonna
Yeah.
resurrect that way, or
Yeah.
what am I gonna look like? Like a good 33? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. All imperfections in your nature, including your physical nature, will be gone. You'll be perfected.
oh yeah, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not healthy for the human body to be obese, nor
Yeah.
is it healthy for the human body to be, too skinny or anything like that. So all physical imperfections will be gone, and it'll be a perfect body.
Hmm.
Um, what that's going to look like, well, God knows. I like the way it's odd, but the way I like to envisage it is, do you know the start of the movie Prometheus
Yeah, yeah.
when you see the aliens?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I like to envisage it like that, something like that.
That would be pretty epic, yeah.
Yeah. The grand, sort of 7 foot tall, built, colossus sort of. Yeah. And
Hmm.
it'll probably not be like that, but that's just how I like to envisage it. But that's just part of the Catholic spiritual tradition that I've come across.
Oh
That it's
man,
going to be, sort of a perfect 33-year-old body.
that's amazing. Well, Gavin, thank you so much for coming on to my show. And I'm just, I love how in the gospel, the resurrection is just so
Mm,
kind of the high point. It leaves you excited and happy and waiting for that future. And then even with this
mm,
conversation where we began with
mm,
creation, then talked about the resurrection, I'm
mm.
leaving this conversation feeling happier and more excited about the world to come. So, Gavin, thank
Okay.
you so much for this. And I hope your book turns out well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, pray for me that, it gets a wee bit easier. There's a lot to do, so pray for me that we,
Yeah.
get it out there. But this is the thing with just writing books anyway.
Yeah, I'm trying to work on my papacy book right now too, and it's a little
Yeah.
tough sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'll just plug your talk with Pat Flynn. I listen to it on my commute, to work. I have a 2.5 hour drive to
Oh
work.
wow.
I went to, I only do it at the start and the end of the week. Lockdown is great because, I get to work from home, so I don't have to do that commute. But I listened to it on my last commute, and a 2.5 hour drive, and I didn't get to the end of it. Just awesome seeing the account, of the papacy and the church and everything. You drawn that out of scripture, so I would really recommend everybody to go and listen to yourself on Pat Flynn's show. It was just awesome to hear. I thought it was just so impressive. So more power to you. Thank you.
Oh, Gavin, I appreciate that compliment. Yeah, I'm very honored. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Gavin, with that, I think that's the end of the episode. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. It was awesome. We talked about a lot, and I hope people enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, I think they will.